An early November Saturday morning in Aspen brought a sharp cold that made outdoor metal as if it had just been dragged from the snow. Ethan Cole pulled up the collar of his faded denim jacket as he walked through the rows of rotting cars behind Blackridge Salvage Yard, where the scent of old motor oil, stagnant rainwater, and rust mingled into the familiar smell of things that were once highly valuable, now forgotten by the world. Mason followed behind his father, clutching a silver toy car with peeling paint on its roof, his slightly tight sneakers scuffing on the wet gravel. The 8-year-old boy hadn't spoken much since the winter his mother passed away. He would just observe things in silence for a long time, only to ask a question that left adults speechless. Ethan had only come here to look for an old gearbox assembly for the 5-star Saint Laurent resort, where he worked as a night shift maintenance technician. He had no plans to buy a car. In fact, his bank account held less than $300 after paying last week's heating bill. But then he saw it. The coupe sat under a slanted tin roof at the far end of the yard, near a steel fence rusted red from years of snow. The paint was almost completely gone, exposing a mottled dark gray metal beneath. The windshield was cracked in one corner. The tires were deflated against the ground, as if it had sat there so long that time itself had forgotten its existence. Ethan slowed his pace. Something was off about the car's proportions. The wheelbase was longer than normal for an older coupe. The curve of the rear fender didn't look like mass industrial stamping. It felt as if it had been hand-shaped by someone deeply obsessed with speed. Mason stood next to his father, tilting his head to look at the car in the exact same way Ethan did. A cold wind swept through the rows of ruined cars behind them. The salvage yard owner, Carter Doyle, stepped out of his small glass booth, holding a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. $100 if you haul it out of here today. He spoke as if he were selling a broken refrigerator. The crusher comes on Monday. Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached out and touched the freezing cold body of the car. Beneath the thick layer of rust was an unusual metal surface, far too smooth for a car that had been left exposed to the elements for so many years. A fleeting memory flashed through his mind. Amelia had stood in their old garage in Boise on a summer night, her hair tied up, hands stained with grease, laughing as she said that some cars weren't built to be vehicles. They were created as art. Ethan swallowed the sudden lump in his throat. He hadn't thought about those words in years. Mason gently touched the car door. "Did it used to go fast, Dad?" Ethan stared at the coupe for a long time before answering. Faster than it was ever allowed to. Carter let out a dry chuckle. "Right now, it goes about 0 miles an hour." Ethan pulled out his wallet. Inside were only a few crumpled bills and an old medical bill he hadn't yet thrown away. He knew he shouldn't buy it. Mason needed new shoes before the snow came. The electric bill was short $217 this month. The home heating system had started making a strange noise last night. A responsible father would walk away from this car. But Ethan handed the bills to Carter anyway. 40 minutes later, his old dark blue pickup truck slowly towed the rusted coupe onto Silver Pine Avenue, a neighborhood tucked beneath the mountainside near Aspen's most luxurious resort. People began to stare. A man walking his dog stopped on the corner. 2 kids riding bicycles slowed down. A curtain parted slightly on the other side of the street. Gossip in neighborhoods like this always travels faster than logic. By the time Ethan backed into his driveway, Vanessa Whitmore was already standing in front of her glass villa, latte in hand. The white Range Rover behind her reflected the cold winter light, shining almost silver blue. Vanessa was 33, a luxury real estate broker, the kind of person who spoke of standards as if they were her personal religion. She looked at the rusted coupe and let out a laugh. Not a loud one, but loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. A failure of a father teaching his kid the quickest way to burn cash I've ever seen. The air went quiet for a beat. Mason stood by the truck. He heard every word. He squeezed a silver toy car in his hand, so hard his knuckles turned white. Ethan turned off the engine. He didn't react right away. No anger, no argument. Just sat still for a few seconds, like a man who had lived through pain far greater than the cheap taunts of a stranger. 3 years ago, he stood in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m, listening to a doctor explain how an SUV spinning out of control on an icy road had crushed almost the entire left side of his wife's body. He had signed medical bills with hands shaking so violently he could barely write his own name. He had spent months lying awake as Mason cried out for his mother in his sleep. After all of that, a few words tossed across the driveway were not enough to break Ethan. He opened the car door. "Mason, could you go inside and grab the toolbox for Dad?" The boy looked at Vanessa one last time, not with anger, just a quiet, heavy stare that made an adult feel far more uncomfortable than any scream ever could. Then he ran inside. Vanessa took a sip of her coffee as if she had just performed a necessary civic duty. Ethan began unhooking the coupe from the truck. Every movement was slow and steady. It was not a performance of composure. He was truly calm. That was the difference. That night, after Mason had fallen asleep on the sofa with his blanket pulled up to his chin, Ethan went back out to the garage behind the house. He switched on the old radio sitting on the tool rack. Jazz drifted softly into the cold air. A single, warm light bulb shone down on the dust-covered body of the car. Ethan began wiping away the first layer of grime with a solvent-soaked rag. Dust floated slowly in the beam of light. The elegant curves of the coupe began to reveal themselves. Then he stopped. Beneath the thick layer of dust near the rear wheel was a weld line so perfect it seemed almost impossible for a car left to rot in a junkyard. This was not an industrial weld. This was not a standard repair. It was the craftsmanship of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan bent down lower. His expression shifted for the first time since that morning. Right then, Mason appeared at the garage door, his hair messy from sleep, clutching a thin blanket to his chest. "Do you think this car was once important to someone, Dad?" Ethan stared at the coupe for a long moment. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. "Yeah, I think someone loved this thing more than money itself." The night wind gently rattled the garage door. Dust drifted slowly in the warm light as Ethan placed his hand on the cold metal. And that was the moment he began to understand that he had just pulled something out of America's forgotten history. The garage behind Ethan Cole's house was always a few degrees colder than the rest of the house in the winter. No one knew exactly why. Maybe the old concrete drew the cold up from the ground, or maybe the metal roll-up door never closed all the way. Amelia used to say this place was like a metal box trying to hold onto memories. That night, as the clock on the wall read 2:07 in the morning, Ethan sat alone in front of the dust-covered coupe under an old yellow light hanging from the garage ceiling. Mason had been asleep for hours on the small sofa inside the house, a blue blanket pulled up to his chin with his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his left arm. Outside, a light snow began to fall. The jazz music from the vintage Panasonic radio sitting next to the toolbox played very softly, just enough to fill the silence, but not enough to break it. Ethan always kept the radio on when he worked at night. Amelia used to hate absolute silence in the garage. She said places with nothing, but the sound of metal made people think too much. Ethan took a rag soaked in solvent and leaned down to wipe the side panel of the car. The years of dust came off as slowly as ash. Under the warm light, the dust motes floating in the air made it feel like the entire garage was suspended in a memory that hadn't quite faded. He wiped another long stroke near the rear wheel. The metal underneath was dark and cold, but not as rough as he had expected. The curves of the body felt too precise, not the kind of precision from an assembly line. It felt like the work of someone who had spent hundreds of hours just to adjust a few millimeters. Ethan paused for a few seconds. Then he kept going. He had spent almost half his life around machinery, hotel elevators, industrial electrical systems, old engines, backup generators. He knew the feeling of someone pouring their soul into a machine. And this coupe had that exact feeling. The radio drifted into a slower jazz tune. Ethan thought of Amelia. It wasn't any grand memory, just a small, quiet scene. A summer night years ago in Boise, when they lived in an apartment so cramped that the garage was actually just a slab of concrete behind the house. Amelia was sitting on the hood of an old Mustang, her hair tied up with a red rubber band, eating pizza and watching Ethan pull apart a carburetor. She once said some people build cars the way artists paint, not for the money, but because they want something that can run faster than their own fears. Ethan had only laughed back then. He didn't understand why he was remembering those exact words now. He kept wiping down the car door. A layer of black paint flaked off at the bottom edge. Underneath it wasn't gray metal, but a very pale silvery blue. Ethan froze. He leaned in closer. It wasn't the kind of common paint used on American cars of the 70s. The color was too unique. It almost glowed under the warm light. The wind whistled softly outside the garage door. Ethan touched the newly exposed old paint. It was ice cold. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. This car had been important, very important. He stood up, grabbed a handheld work light, and went back to the front wheel. As the beam swept across the undercarriage, Ethan saw a subframe that had been reinforced by hand. This wasn't a post-accident repair. This wasn't the work of an amateur tuner. This was the craftsmanship of someone who understood exactly how torque would affect the body at extreme speeds. Ethan sat down on a low rolling stool. For a long time, he didn't move. The radio kept on playing. Outside, the snow fell heavier. After a moment, Ethan pulled out his phone, snapped a few photos of the chassis, and zoomed in close on the sequence of characters near the rear axle. It didn't look like a standard VIN. The first three characters were nearly faded away, but still clear enough to make out. VLR. He tried searching for it online. No results. He kept searching. Old forums popped up with outdated layouts, white text on black backgrounds, like relics from the early 2000s. Ethan read through thread after thread about lost American racing prototypes, projects canceled before they ever hit the track, and engineers who vanished from motorsport after tragic test crashes. 2:48 in the morning. Ethan leaned back in his seat. His eyes were strained, but he didn't feel sleepy. Under the dim lights, the coupe sat in silence like an old beast in hibernation. He stared at it for a long time. Then, out of nowhere, he remembered his last night with Amelia. The snow had been falling just like this. She had been standing by the kitchen doorway, pulling on her gloves, turning her head to ask if he wanted pancakes, before she took Mason to his ski lesson the next morning. Such an ordinary question. No background music, no warning signs. No one knew it would be the last time. The accident happened less than 10 hours later. 3 years had passed, but Ethan still remembered exactly how the hospital hallway felt at 10:47 that night. The harsh white lights, the smell of antiseptic, the low hum of the vending machine. A nurse passing by, unable to look him in the eyes. There are some kinds of loss that never go away. They just learn to sit quietly inside of you. Ethan bowed his head. His hands were still stained with fine metallic dust. The radio finished its jazz set and transitioned into a commercial for a ski resort near Aspen Ridge. Ethan reached out and turned the volume down. Just then, something caught his eye. A tiny indentation near the inner edge of the door. It didn't look natural. Ethan grabbed a cloth and rubbed harder. The layer of grime wiped away. Underneath, a tiny emblem appeared, stamped directly into the metal, a V-shape, stretching out like a pair of wings. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had seen this logo somewhere before. Not in everyday life, in an old article, or maybe a racing documentary. He couldn't quite place it yet. But he knew one thing for sure. This $100 car had never belonged in a junkyard. The next morning, Aspen was draped in a thin, silver-gray dust of snow, making the entire neighborhood around Silver Pine Avenue feel as though its volume had been turned down. Ethan had barely slept. He brewed a pot of coffee at 5:12 a.m., standing in the kitchen and watching the faint glow of the garage light in the backyard, still burning from the night before putting on his coat to head out for his early shift at the St. Laurent resort. All through the morning, the image of the coupe never left his mind, not because of its value, but because of the feeling. Anyone who has spent years working with machinery knows the difference between something built to survive and something built out of obsession. That car bore the marks of pure obsession. Ethan tried to focus on repairing a heat sensor in the spa's basement, but his mind kept drifting back to the letters VLR on the chassis and that wing-shaped emblem stamped deep into the metal. At 11:43 in the morning, he returned to the garage. Mason was sitting on the floor with a bowl of cereal in front of him, rolling a silver toy car back and forth against the legs of a chair. "Did you stay up all night, Dad?" Ethan took off his coat. "Pretty much." Mason glanced over at the coupe, now draped under a blue tarp in the corner of the garage. "I don't think it likes being outside for too long." Ethan let out a soft, quiet laugh. He didn't know why a simple comment from an 8-year-old could make his chest feel so heavy. After a quick lunch of cold sandwiches and canned soup, Ethan pulled a stool up to the old laptop on his workbench and began uploading photos of the car online. He had taken them with meticulous care, the sweep of the rear wheel arches, the hand-welded seams along the undercarriage, the wing-shaped emblem, the sequence of the chassis number. the silver blue paint peeking through the flaking black coat. Finally, he posted them on an old motorsport forum called the American Endurance Archive, a site with an interface so dated it felt like a corner of the internet forgotten 20 years ago. The title of the post was simple: "Anyone know anything about a VLR chassis?" Ethan didn't write much. He just gave a brief description, explaining that he'd found the coupe in an Aspen junkyard and wanted to know if it was some kind of old custom build. Then he shut the laptop. That should have been the end of it, but 18 minutes later his phone began to vibrate relentlessly. One reply, then 3 more, then 11. By late afternoon, the thread had eclipsed 100 comments. For a forum with only a few thousand active aging vintage car enthusiasts, this was highly unusual. Ethan sat in silence before the screen. The experts were already arguing. One user claimed it was nothing more than an 80s kit car, pieced together from spare parts. Another shot back immediately. "No way. Look at the geometry on that rear axle." A user named Flat6 Nevada wrote, "If that chassis is genuine, this isn't a street car." Someone else asked Ethan to take a clear photo of the front subframe. Ethan did. 10 minutes later, the forum nearly exploded. A comment was pinned to the top by a longtime moderator. "Someone tag Marcus L87 in here right now. If anyone is going to recognize this thing, it's him." That single name started drawing more people in. Old accounts that had been inactive for years began returning to the thread. The atmosphere began to shift. It was no longer just casual curiosity. It felt more like old-timers in an industry watching a ghost from the past step out of the fog. Ethan read through the replies line by line. Someone pointed out that the coupe's design language resembled an endurance racing prototype from the early 70s. Another said the winged logo looked like Vail Racing Labs, a short-lived secret division under Richard Vail before he built his billion-dollar supercar empire, Vail Dynamics. Another comment read, "No way. Every VLR prototype was declared destroyed after the 1976 fire." Ethan froze. The fire. He began to realize he had stumbled into something far bigger than just an old car. On the sofa, Mason was eating cookies, his small legs swinging back and forth. "Are you famous now, Dad?" Ethan stared at the screen, which was flooding with new notifications. "Nobody, just some car enthusiasts." But even he didn't believe that anymore. 6:22 in the evening, an account named Desert Track Historian posted a reply that was nearly a page long. The user claimed to have worked in motorsports in Arizona during the late 70s and insisted that Ethan's coupe shared near-identical proportions with a lost prototype nicknamed the Phantom VLR7. According to him, the car had never been shown to the public. It was built to test a weight distribution system that was nearly 15 years ahead of its time. The prototype vanished after a fire at a test garage in Nevada. No one had ever seen it since. The forum went dead silent for nearly 10 minutes. Then a wave of replies flooded in. Some called bullshit. Others began analyzing every single pixel of the photos Ethan had posted. A chassis expert from Detroit wrote that the welds on the undercarriage were too precise to have been done in any backyard garage of that era. Another insisted that the subframe design could only have come from a professional racing team. Ethan lost all track of time as he read. Outside the garage, the snow was falling heavier now. Streetlights cast a cold amber glow through the dust-filmed window panes. The jazz radio hummed softly in the background. Mason had drifted off to sleep on the sofa, his small silver toy car still clutched in his hand. Ethan watched his son for a quiet moment, then looked back at the screen. That was when a brand new account, one that had never posted before, appeared. No avatar, no info. A username of just one word, Hayes. This user didn't engage in the arguments, only posted one single line. "If this is real, you're sitting on a piece of American history." The night shift at the St. Laurent resort always made Ethan feel like he was living in two different worlds. Above ground, warm, soft lights reflected off Italian marble floors. Champagne glasses clinked softly in the rooftop restaurant, and the scent of expensive perfume drifted through quiet hallways, as if life had never known overdue bills or late-night hospital visits. Down on the maintenance floor where Ethan worked, there was the drone of water pumps, heat radiating from steam pipes, and gray concrete walls that vibrated gently with the movement of the elevators. On the third night after the forum post blew up, Ethan brought Mason with him to the hotel because school was canceled due to a blizzard. Mason sat in the corner of the maintenance room, wrapped in a thin blanket, doing his homework, while rolling a silver toy car along the edge of the desk. Around 11 at night, Grace Miller walked down to the maintenance floor, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate on a paper tray. She worked as a server at the hotel's 13th floor lounge, her evening shifts usually running until nearly midnight. Grace was 30, her blonde hair tied back low, her eyes always carrying the weariness of someone who had lived under financial strain for too long, yet still tried to remain kind to the world. She placed a cup of chocolate down next to Mason. "You need to get some sleep before you turn into a zombie." Mason smiled for the first time all day. Grace turned to Ethan. "Your forum thread is going crazy." Ethan lightly tightened his grip on the wrench in his hand. "You saw it too? The whole lounge is talking about it. One guest even asked me if the car was real." Grace leaned back against the metal table behind her, the fluorescent lights reflecting off her face, making her look paler than usual. "I think you should be careful." Ethan looked at her for a few seconds. "Why's that?" "Because things of great value usually attract the wrong kind of people." Silence settled over the room for a moment. The steady hum of the heating system buzzed overhead. By then, Mason had fallen asleep on the small sofa near the maintenance room, his blanket slipping halfway off his shoulder. Grace walked over and pulled the blanket back up for him. The gesture was completely natural. Ethan watched her and found himself thinking of Amelia. That same gentle care, the same way of touching someone as if terrified of waking them. Grace turned back. "You miss your wife a lot, don't you?" It was the first time in months anyone had asked him that directly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He set the wrench down on the table and sat on a metal chair next to the backup generator. "Some days, I think I'm okay." His voice was quiet and raspy. "Then suddenly, I'll hear a song in the supermarket or see someone wearing a jacket like hers, and it all comes rushing back like it was just yesterday." Grace listened in silence, without interrupting. No empty words of comfort. That was what Ethan was most grateful for. Amelia loved cars even more than I did. He smiled softly. She could sit for 3 hours just talking about how a vintage Ferrari engine sounded compared to a Porsche. Grace smiled. Sounds like she was the kind of person who made life a little louder. "Yeah." Ethan looked down at his hands after she passed. "The house was so quiet, I used to leave the radio on all night, just to have some sound." The faint hum of the ventilation system echoed from the far end of the hallway. Outside the small window near the maintenance stairs, the snow kept falling slowly. Grace sat down in the chair across from him. "I tried searching the archives for that winged logo you posted yesterday." Ethan looked up. "Where did you look?" "The hotel's digital archive. The owner of the Saint Laurent is obsessed with vintage motorsports, so they keep a lot of old racing magazines in their private database." Grace pulled out her phone and opened a black and white photo. The photo showed an old racing garage from the 1970s. In the left corner of the frame, you could see part of a coupe with the exact same body lines as the car Ethan had in his garage. Right beside it was the winged logo. Ethan's heart beat a little faster. The text underneath the photo had almost completely faded with time, but part of it was still readable. "Vale Racing Laboratories." Grace looked at him. "I don't think your car is just some regular car, Ethan." He leaned back in his chair. For a few seconds, the only sound in the maintenance room was the steady hum of machinery and the faint drift of jazz radio from the corner. Ethan didn't understand why someone like Grace would take the time to look this up for him. Maybe because she knew what it felt like to be pushed down so low by life, yet still try to hold on to some last shred of dignity. Or maybe she was just a kind person. A rare thing these days. Mason stirred on the sofa, slowly opening his eyes. "Dad." "Yeah, buddy." "If that car really is famous, do we have to sell it?" Ethan looked at his son, then down at his grease-stained hands. He paused for a few seconds before answering. "I don't know yet." Mason rubbed his eyes. "I like it better in our garage." Grace let out a soft laugh. Ethan smiled too, a small, genuine smile. And for the first time since Amelia passed, the old garage and that rusty car didn't make him think only of loss. On the 4th night after the coupe appeared on the forum, the temperature outside in Aspen dropped to -8 degrees. A thin layer of snow coated the glass of the garage door behind Ethan's house, turning the warm yellow light inside into a hazy halo against the gray-white night. 2:14 in the morning. An old Panasonic radio played a vintage jazz track, the saxophone so low and smoky it felt less like music and more like a memory. Ethan knelt beside the rear quarter panel, holding a piece of ultrafine sandpaper. He wasn't scrubbing the coupe like a piece of junk anymore. The way he touched it now was like someone excavating something buried deep beneath the layers of time. Mason slept on the sofa in the corner of the garage, his head tilted to one side, the silver toy car still clutched in his hand like every other night. The light caught the dust motes drifting slowly through the air. Ethan took a deep breath and kept going. The black paint flaked away, bit by bit. Beneath it, the strange silver-blue hue he'd glimpsed the night before began to emerge. Not navy, not a standard chrome silver. It was a shifting, liquid shade that seemed to change with the angle of the light like a lake at dawn. He had never seen a paint color like this on a vintage American car. The whisper of the sandpaper moving against the metal was barely audible, steady, patient. Then Ethan stopped. Revealed beneath the paint was a thin white stripe running along the side of the car. It wasn't some cheap aftermarket pinstriping. This was original. Ethan's heart began to beat faster. He took half a step back, taking in the section of the bodywork he had just freed from the decaying black paint. For a fleeting moment, the coupe no longer looked like a junkyard relic. It began to look like something that once went incredibly fast, incredibly expensive, and incredibly dangerous. Ethan took a few more photos on his phone and sent them to Grace. Her reply came less than 3 minutes later. That paint isn't ordinary. Right after, she sent another photo, a screenshot from the St. Laurent Hotel archives, an old motorsport article from 1974. The grainy black and white photo showed 3 men standing in front of a racing garage in Nevada. Behind them was the front end of a car bearing the exact same white stripe Ethan had just uncovered. The headline beneath the photo read, "Vail Racing Laboratories prepares a private endurance prototype for desert testing." Ethan stared at the screen for a long time. A private prototype. He turned his head to look at the coupe behind him. The garage suddenly felt too small for it. Outside, the wind picked up, making the metal garage door rattle softly. Ethan went back to work. He moved to the B-pillar behind the driver's side door, where the paint was unusually thick. The deeper he sanded, the more he realized someone had deliberately tried to hide this coupe's identity. It wasn't a standard touch-up job. They were erasing its true identity. An hour later, Ethan's fingertips were nearly numb from the cold. Then he saw it, a tiny emblem stamped directly into the steel. Not a manufacturer's logo, but a signature. 3 letters joined together in sharp hand-engraved strokes. L.H. Ethan sat in complete silence. In the background, the radio continued to play soft jazz. Outside, the snow kept falling. He had seen that name somewhere on the forums before. Leonard Hayes, a legendary chassis engineer who worked for Vail Racing Laboratories before vanishing from motorsport in the mid-1970s. Ethan pulled his laptop over on the workbench and began to search. The forum nearly exploded when he posted a picture of the signature. Notifications began flooding his screen. It couldn't be. Holy hell. That was definitely Hayes' mark. A user named Old Track Engineer wrote, Leonard Hayes always signed his chassis by hand before the car was finished. He believed an engineer should sign his masterpiece just like a painter signs a painting. Another user replied almost instantly, if this is real, Ethan is sitting on a lost VLR prototype. The debate raged on for hours. Some argued the Coupa was just a replica built from old spare parts. But then, a verified account from a motorsport museum in California joined the thread. They asked Ethan to take a photo of the subframe beneath the driver's seat. Ethan did. 10 minutes later, a reply popped up. This is an experimental magnesium tube frame. It didn't exist on any production car in 1974. Ethan read the line twice, then 3 times. On the sofa, Mason tossed and turned, his blanket slipping to the floor. Ethan stood up to pull the blanket back over his son. As he walked back to the coupe, he suddenly felt like he was no longer standing next to just an object, but beside a piece of history. 3:41 in the morning. Grace's video call came through. Her face appeared on his screen, framed by the warm, dim glow of the hotel lounge behind her. Ethan, I found this in the old archives. She angled her camera down to show a faded, yellowed scanned document, an internal newsletter from Vail Racing Laboratories dated August 1974. Right in the middle was a photo of engineer Leonard Hayes standing beside a coupe draped in a white sheet. The caption beneath it sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. Project Phantom VLR7, Experimental Endurance Platform. Top secret. Ethan stared at the screen. Phantom. The air in the garage grew strangely heavy. Grace lowered her voice. Do you remember the fire people were talking about on the forum? Yeah, I found another article about it. She flipped to the next page. A newspaper clipping from Nevada from 1976 appeared on the screen. A massive headline took up nearly half the page. Massive fire destroys Vail racing test facility. Ethan quickly read the text below. The test garage burned for nearly 8 hours. Several prototypes were completely destroyed. Among the missing vehicles was the Phantom VLR-7, declared permanently destroyed. Ethan said nothing. Grace was silent for a few seconds too. Then she asked softly, if that car is in your garage, then what was it that burned to the ground in 1976? By Friday morning, Silver Pine Avenue no longer looked at Ethan's coupe as a pile of scrap metal. It became the thing that made people draw their curtains at midnight. The thing that made conversations stop whenever Ethan walked by. And the thing that made the whole neighborhood start behaving differently, in a very uncomfortable way. It all started after a major motorsport social media account reposted a photo of the coupe with the caption, "Possible lost VLR prototype discovered in Aspen." The post spread faster than Ethan could have ever imagined. By that afternoon, an analysis video of the car had reached over 2 million views. A supercar YouTuber called it the holy grail of American endurance racing. Ethan Cole's name started appearing in minor news articles. People started showing up at Blackridge Salvage Yard just to ask which corner the car had been sitting in. And outside the garage behind Ethan's house, people began lingering on the street, staring, almost all day long. That morning, Ethan was replacing an elevator relay set at the St. Laurent Resort when his phone buzzed continuously in his pocket. Texts, missed calls, emails, he barely read them. Not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because he didn't know how he felt about it yet. Around 5 in the afternoon, as Ethan drove home, he saw 2 SUVs parked across the street from his garage. 3 men were standing near the fence. One of them was recording a video on his phone. Mason, sitting in the passenger seat, immediately looked out the window. "Are they looking at our car, Dad?" "Yeah, do they like it?" "I guess so." Ethan replied in a very quiet voice. He hated the feeling of people looking into his life like it was a reality show. As the pickup truck pulled into the driveway, the 3 men turned around immediately. One of them stepped forward first. "Are you Mr. Ethan Cole?" Ethan nodded. "I'm with Denver Motors Weekly. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the VLR prototype." "No." Ethan cut him off, keeping his tone polite. "Not today." The man still tried to force a smile. "It will only take 5 minutes." Ethan looked back at Mason, who was getting out of the truck behind him. The boy hated strangers, especially since Amelia's accident. "No." Ethan's voice was firmer this time. Then he opened the garage door. The coupe sat under a blue tarp in the warm yellow light, as if it too was trying to hide from the world outside. One of the men tried to steal a glance inside before the door closed. The news spread faster than Ethan had expected, and the entire neighborhood began to change under the new light of wealth. The neighbor who had ignored him for 2 years now started waving to him every morning. The woman from down the street brought over cookies, claiming she had baked too many. A couple Ethan had never even spoken to asked if Mason wanted to come over for a play date this weekend. No one mentioned the $100 car anymore. No one brought up what Vanessa Whitmore had said. But that only made everything feel more unsettling. Vanessa was the one who had changed the most. 3 days ago, she had been laughing out loud in Ethan's driveway. Now she kept looking over at the garage behind his house through the glass windows of her mansion. She started searching Google for Richard Vail's name, Vail Dynamics, the VLR prototype, motorsport history. In the middle of the night, she sat in front of her laptop until nearly 2 a.m., only to realize that the rusty coupe might be worth far more than the very house she lived in. What bothered Vanessa the most wasn't the money. It was the fact that she had mocked Ethan right in front of the entire neighborhood, and everyone remembered. On Saturday morning, while Ethan was wiping the dust off the front of the car, Vanessa appeared at the garage entrance. She wasn't holding a latte. She wasn't wearing sunglasses. Her usual cold, confident demeanor was completely gone. She stood outside the door for a few seconds before she spoke. I should apologize for the other day." Ethan kept wiping down the metal in front of him. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. That only made Vanessa more uncomfortable. "I shouldn't have said that in front of Mason." Only then did Ethan look up. A cold draft slipped through the cracked open garage door. Old snow still clung to the edge of the metal roof. He looked at Vanessa for a long moment before speaking. What bothered me most wasn't what you said about me. It was that the boy heard it. Vanessa cast her eyes down for the first time since Ethan had known her. The silence stretched long enough for both of them to hear the faint sound of jazz playing on the radio inside the garage. Then Mason ran out from the house, holding a box of cereal. He stopped when he saw Vanessa. The air stilled for a second. But Mason just looked at the coupe behind his father and asked, completely naturally, "What do you think we should call it, Dad?" Ethan leaned back against the car. He hadn't thought about it. Mason stepped closer to the coupe. The warm yellow light reflected off the silver-blue paint, slowly emerging from beneath the tarnished metal, making the car look as if it existed and didn't all at once. The boy tilted his head, staring at it for a long moment, just like Ethan had on his first day at the scrapyard. Then Mason said softly, "Ghost." Vanessa frowned slightly. "Why?" Mason put his hand on the car door. "Because everyone thinks it's gone." No one said a word after that. Outside, the wind brushed through the snow-laden trees, making a faint rustling sound like dry paper scraping together. Ethan looked at his son. In that moment, he suddenly realized that Mason didn't just see the coupe as a car anymore. To him, it was something found, something the whole world had forgotten but had finally returned. Vanessa stood in silence for a few seconds outside the garage. And for the first time since moving to Silver Pine Avenue, she felt like the smallest person on the street. Sunday morning in Aspen was so quiet you could hear the snow slipping off the pine branches at the far end of the street. 8:17 in the morning. Ethan was changing the light bulb in front of the garage when he heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady engine rumble in the far distance. But it was different from any normal car. There was something far too precise in the rhythm of that engine. Silver Pine Avenue rarely saw strange cars, let alone several at once, especially on a freezing morning like this. So when the first black SUV turned onto the snow-covered street, a few curtains began to twitch open. Then came the second one, and then the third. 3 gloss black Cadillac Escalades rolled slowly across the ice-covered pavement, moving with a silence that seemed almost unnatural for machines of that size. A man walking his dog on the corner stopped dead in his tracks. Across the street, a woman stepped out onto her porch in her bathrobe. Vanessa Whitmore stood frozen behind the glass of her home as the convoy pulled up in front of Ethan's driveway. No one said a word, but everyone in the neighborhood knew one thing. Whatever was sitting in the garage behind Ethan Cole's house was no longer just an internet rumor. The door of the middle Escalade swung open. A man stepped out. Richard Vail didn't look like the man on the covers of the financial magazines. He was tall, lean, with cropped silver hair, wearing a simple charcoal wool coat instead of an expensive suit. No diamond-encrusted watch, no wall of bodyguards. Just that quiet, unmistakable presence of someone who had spent a lifetime around machines built for lethal speeds. He stood there for a few seconds, studying the old garage behind Ethan's house. Then he began to walk toward it. His steps were slow and deliberate in the snow. 2 other men followed a few paces behind, keeping just enough distance to keep the moment from feeling like a display of power. Ethan pulled the garage door open before Richard Vail could even knock. The coupe sat bathed in the warm yellow light at the center of the garage. Almost half of the body was now clean, revealing a pale silver-blue paint that made the car look like a ghost, slowly being dragged back through time. Richard stood frozen. For a long, heavy moment, he didn't say a word. Ethan noticed the older man's hands tighten slightly at the sight of the sweeping curve near the rear wheel arch. Then Richard moved closer, slowly, like a man approaching his own memories. He reached out, his hand brushing against the cold metal. The gesture was almost reverent. Through the garage window, Ethan could see a few neighbors lingering out on the street, pretending to shovel snow or walk their dogs just to catch a glimpse inside. Nobody was leaving. Richard circled the coupe once, then a second time. Finally, he stopped by the B-pillar, right where Ethan had found the signature, .lh. The garage was so quiet, the only sound was the faint hum of a jazz radio playing in the far corner. Richard placed his fingertips on the signature. Something shifted in his eyes. Ethan had never seen that kind of expression on an older man's face. It wasn't quite grief. It was the look of someone who had just found something they had spent decades forcing themselves to believe was gone forever. Leonard Hayes. Richard spoke in a whisper. The name wasn't meant for anyone else in the garage. It was meant for the past. Ethan stood there, silent. Richard turned to look at him for the very first time. Where did you find it? Blackridge Salvage Yard. Richard chuckled softly. $1 million prototype sitting in a salvage yard in the middle of Aspen. Leonard probably would have found this pretty funny 13. He took a step back, looking over the entire goop. This is the Phantom VLR-7. When the garage moved, Mason appeared at the door connecting the kitchen to the garage, his hair still messy from sleep, clutching a box of cereal. The boy looked at the strangers in black coats and instinctively stepped closer to Ethan. Richard watched Mason for a few seconds before turning back to the coupe. We built it in 1974. His voice was slow and deep. Back then, the American supercar industry was being left in the dust by Europe in endurance racing. Ferrari dominated. Porsche was a decade ahead. Leonard Hayes was the only man I ever met crazy enough to believe we could build something faster than all of them. Richard placed his hand on the body of the car. He designed this chassis almost entirely by hand. No computer simulations, no AI. Just mathematics, intuition, and obsession. Ethan looked at the coupe under the warm yellow lights. For the first time, he truly understood why the car felt so different. Richard continued. Leonard believed weight was not something to be reduced. He believed it just needed to be moved to the right place. One of the men with Richard opened a tablet and set it on the workbench. A series of old blueprints appeared on the screen. Weight distribution system, magnesium chassis tubes, asymmetrical rear geometry. Things the modern supercar industry only started adopting more than 10 years later. Richard looked at Ethan. Do you know what the strangest part is? Ethan remained silent. This car never raced officially, not even once. He walked around the front of the car. But almost every modern American hypercar carries its DNA. The air in the garage grew heavy. Outside, many of the neighbors were now standing out in the street. Vanessa Whitmore was there too. No more latte, no more cold pride, only the look of someone realizing she had once mocked something the entire world would bow down to. Richard stopped in front of the driver's side door. In 1976, our test facility in Nevada burned for 8 hours. He looked down at the concrete floor as if staring back through the years. We thought the Phantom had burned with everything else. Leonard had died 6 months before that during a high-speed test in Utah. No one said anything. The jazz music was still playing very softly at the back of the garage. Richard offered a sad, quiet smile. He used to say this car would change the industry. If only the world had enough patience to understand it. Maybe he's right, Mason gently tugged on Ethan's sleeve. Dad, yeah, buddy. Is the ghost really famous now? Richard overheard him too. He turned to Mason for the first time, the ghost. Mason nodded. I named it that because everyone thought it had disappeared. A silence stretched for a few seconds. Then Richard Vail laughed for the first time since entering the garage. It was a very soft laugh, but genuine. Leonard would have loved that name. He looked back at the coupe once more. His aging eyes reflected the silver blue paint under the yellow light. Then Richard said the words that made the entire garage go completely silent. Little man, your dad just found the very thing that once changed the history of American hypercars. The garage behind Ethan's house was warmer than usual that night, crowded with so many people standing inside. Breathes turned to mist under the old yellow light hanging from the ceiling. In the corner, the Panasonic radio still hummed jazz softly, as if it had no idea its owner's life had just changed forever. The ghost sat in the middle of the room, half history, half legend. Its silver blue paint reflected light as soft as a winter lake, while the remaining scratches on the doors made it feel like something the world had forgotten for far too long. Richard Vail stood by the coupe for a long time before speaking again. There are people who would pay any price to bring this into their private collection. His voice was low and calm. Behind him, a man opened a black leather briefcase and pulled out a tablet along with some documents. The air in the garage shifted slightly. Even the people out on the driveway began to grow quiet, as if they could feel that something massive was about to happen. Richard turned to Ethan. I don't want the ghost to disappear ever again. He placed his hand on the hood of the car. I want to buy it. Ethan looked at him, saying nothing. Richard continued. $5 million. The garage fell so quiet that Ethan could hear the soft slide of snow falling off the tin roof outside. Grace, standing near the door, drew in a quiet breath. Out on the driveway, Vanessa Whitmore froze as she heard that figure echo from the old garage of the man she had once mocked in front of the entire neighborhood. $5 million. Silver Pine Avenue had never seen anything of that value appear here. But Ethan didn't react the way everyone expected. No shock. He didn't burst into laughter. He didn't jump to his feet. He just stared at the ghost for a long time, as if trying to understand how a pile of dust-covered metal from just a few days ago had now become something powerful enough to make the entire world rush to Aspen. Richard watched Ethan for a few seconds, then smiled faintly. "Do you know what the most interesting part is?" Ethan remained silent. Most people, when they hear that number, look at the screen first. He looked down at Ethan's hands, stained with metal dust. "But you look at the car." A long silence stretched between them. Mason was sitting on the sofa with a cereal bowl on his lap, completely unaware of just how massive $5 million really was. The little boy just looked at Ethan, as if his father's decision was the only thing that mattered. Richard took another slow walk around the coupe. "The Ghost isn't just a rare car," he said softly. "It's the missing link of the American hypercar industry. Leonard Hayes built this chassis system before the rest of the industry even understood he was looking at the future." Richard stopped near the LH signature on the B-pillar. A lot of people made billions of dollars off Leonard's ideas, but almost no one remembers his name anymore. Ethan looked at the small signature on the cold steel. Then he looked up. "If I sell it." Richard gave a very slight nod. "The car must be publicly displayed." No one interrupted him. No one moved. Ethan continued, "I don't want it locked away in some billionaire's garage in Dubai or Monaco, only to disappear all over again." Richard looked at him for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "Agreed." Ethan took a deep breath. "Leonard Hayes' name has to be the first thing people see. Not Richard Vale, not Vale Dynamics. Leonard Hayes." One of the men behind Richard shifted uncomfortably as if to speak, but Richard raised a hand to stop him. He stared at Ethan for a long moment, then said, "Leonard would have liked you." Silence fell over the garage once more. The faint sound of jazz continued to drift from a dark corner. Mason got up from the sofa and walked over to the Ghost. He placed his hand on the car door, just as he always did. Ethan watched his son for a few quiet seconds. Then he went on. "And there is one more thing." Richard waited. "Mason's name needs to be on it too." Mason looked up. Ethan placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "He's the one who named it Ghost. He was the first one to see the car as something alive." Richard looked at the boy standing next to the coupe's body, bathed in the yellow light. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "All right." His voice was quieter this time. "The boy's name will be on the display plaque." Mason looked at Ethan. "Really, Dad?" Ethan smiled gently for the first time that night. "Yeah." Richard turned to his assistant. "Draft a new contract." He paused for a few seconds, then added, "And add this in. The Ghost will be the centerpiece of the new motorsport exhibition at the Rocky Mountain Motors Heritage Museum. No private collections, no hidden storage. Everyone will get to see it." Standing out on the driveway, Vanessa heard those words and slowly lowered her head, because at that moment she finally understood that what made her feel most ashamed wasn't that Ethan was about to become a millionaire, but that a man could receive a $5 million offer and still think first of a forgotten engineer and his young son. Richard stepped up to Ethan and extended his hand. "I think Leonard Hayes chose the right man to find the Ghost." Ethan looked at the hand for a few seconds before shaking it. It wasn't the handshake of a business deal 33-34, but rather a moment when two men both understood that some things in life are worth far more than money. 34. Outside the garage, snow was still falling very slowly onto Silver Pine Avenue. And in the dim yellow light behind Ethan Cole's small house, the Ghost sat in silence, as if it had finally found its way back to the world. 3 weeks after Richard Vale left Silver Pine Avenue with his legal team and a $5 million contract, Ethan Cole's life began to change in a very quiet way. Not the kind of change people see on the internet. No new supercars, no mansions, no champagne, no boastful interviews about a life changed overnight. Ethan still woke up at 5 in the morning. He still brewed coffee with the old machine Amelia had bought on sale years ago. He still turned on the jazz radio in the garage every night. And he kept driving that old blue pickup to the St. Laurent Hotel for nearly 2 weeks, until the head of maintenance finally pulled him aside to ask why a millionaire was still fixing elevators on the graveyard shift 1. Ethan just smiled. He didn't know how to start being a different kind of person just yet. The first thing he did when the money cleared wasn't buying anything for himself. It was calling St. Mary Regional Hospital, 10:42 on a Tuesday morning. He sat alone at the kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him as the pale winter sunlight filtered through the curtains. The billing clerk went silent for nearly 10 seconds after Ethan asked to pay off the rest of Amelia's medical bills. That debt had hung over him for nearly 3 years. Those white bills always arrived just when he thought he was starting to breathe a little easier. Envelopes that made Ethan feel like he was still paying for the worst night of his life. The call was over in less than 5 minutes. There was no background music, no grand tears. Just Ethan sitting quietly in the kitchen long after the laptop screen had gone dark. For the first time in years, the house felt lighter, like a room that finally had its windows thrown open after a winter that lasted too long. That afternoon, Ethan took Mason to the Aspen Ridge Mall. The boy thought they were just getting groceries, until Ethan stopped in front of a kid's shoe store. Mason stared at a pair of white and gray sneakers with blue soles for a long, quiet moment. They were the same shoes he'd stood staring at through the display glass nearly 6 months ago, before pretending he didn't like them because he knew his dad was struggling. Ethan still remembered. "Go ahead and try them on." Mason looked up at him. "Really?" "Yeah." He slipped on the new shoes and took a few tentative steps across the store's polished hardwood floor, walking with a careful gentleness, as if he were afraid of ruining something too expensive. Ethan stood there watching his son. A very strange feeling settled in his chest. Not exactly joy, more like a sudden lightness, as though for years he'd been holding up the roof to keep it from collapsing on the two of them. And now, finally, he was allowed to let go of some of the weight. A week later, work began on the garage behind the house. Nothing too big, nothing fancy. Ethan only added an extra work bay and replaced the old lighting with a warmer golden glow. He kept the old Panasonic radio. He kept the oil-stained workbench. He even kept the small scorch mark on the concrete floor from when Amelia had knocked over a welding torch years ago. Grace came by almost every night to help paint the walls or pack things away. And Mason ran around the garage in his new sneakers so much that Ethan had to tell him to slow down at least 10 times a day. The neighbors started treating them a little more normally. Or, at least, they tried to. Vanessa Whitmore stopped standing out on her driveway with a latte every morning. She started greeting Ethan in a much softer voice. Once, she brought over a box of homemade cookies, looking so awkward she nearly dropped them on his doorstep. Ethan remained polite, but the distance between them was permanent now. Some things, once said, hang in the air for a long time. At the end of that month, Ethan transferred a large sum to a newly established scholarship fund at Aspen Valley Elementary School. He named the fund the Amelia Cole Memorial Fund. No press, no public announcements. Just a short, simple email sent to the school administration. For the kids whose parents are just trying to keep their families afloat, the principal called to thank him, her voice thick with tears. Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he just said he hoped the money would help, and then he hung up. That could have been the end of it. But 3 weeks later, the Rocky Mountain Motors Heritage Museum officially opened its ghost exhibit. On opening night, Denver was dusted with a light layer of snow. Outside the museum, a long line of people waited under the warm amber streetlights, which reflected off the cold, wet pavement. Journalists, classic car collectors, people who had followed the story on obscure online forums, and those who were simply curious to see the car that had been left to rot in an Aspen scrapyard. Ethan hated crowds, but Mason had been so excited he could barely sleep the night before. As they stepped into the museum's main hall, the entire room seemed to light up around the ghost. It sat on a low platform under spotlights meticulously adjusted to capture every angle. Its silver-blue paint reflected the light, soft and fluid as water. No more dust, no more rust. No more feeling of being forgotten. But somehow, the coupe still held the exact same soul Ethan had seen that first day at Blackridge Salvage Yard. Richard Vale was standing near the back of the hall, talking with a few reporters, but he fell silent the moment he saw Masons approach the car. The boy walked slowly. His new sneakers squeaked softly against the polished stone floor. He stood before the ghost for a long time. The warm light reflecting on his young face made Ethan suddenly remember Amelia in their old garage, all those years ago. Mason read the metal plaque next to the car very slowly. Leonard Hayes, Vale Racing Laboratories, recovered by Ethan Cole, renamed Ghost by Mason Cole. The boy stared at his name for a few seconds, then turned to Ethan. Dad, yeah, son, is Ghost going to stay here forever? Ethan stepped up to stand beside his son. He looked at the coupe under the museum lights. He looked at the sweeping curves that had once sat dusty and cold in the garage behind their house. He saw the faint H signature still visible on the B pillar, and then he nodded. Yeah. Mason was quiet. After a moment, the boy reached out and took his father's hand. His hand was small and warm. The father and son stood together under the warm gallery lights, while the crowd drifted past them like water flowing around a stone that had stood still in the heart of winter. And somewhere amid the fading footsteps echoing in that vast hall, Ethan had a feeling Amelia would have known exactly what this car was from the very first moment she laid eyes on it. There are things in life that at first glance look like nothing more than forgotten junk at the back of a junkyard. A dust-covered car, a man quietly working the night shift, a child wearing shoes that had been too tight for months. And sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't poverty or failure. It's how easily we get used to judging a person's worth solely by what's on the surface. Silver Pine Avenue used to look at Ethan Cole as just another single father trying to survive the winter. No one saw the sleepless nights he spent staring at hospital bills. No one saw how hard he fought to keep his son feeling safe after they lost his mother. Just like no one saw the history hidden beneath the rust of the Ghost. Perhaps life is always that way. The things that truly matter rarely scream for attention. They just exist in silence, waiting for someone patient enough to stop and look closer than the rest of the world. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If life ever makes you feel like the world sees you as nothing more than ordinary, remember that sometimes the things left forgotten the longest are the ones that hold the greatest value. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, someone is quiet enough to recognize the magic inside you long before the rest of the world even notices.